So let's begin chapter 6. Chapter 6 is on contracts and business law. And you might have taken some business law classes in high school or maybe even college. And if you enjoyed those classes, you might enjoy this. It's a good chapter to take notes in, because there are a few different concepts that you will see later. And there are quite a few things that apply to your everyday business. In fact, when we look at contracts and contract law, that's really kind of what you're getting a license to do, is write or draft these purchase agreements and listing agreements and exclusive buyer agency agreements to go through that paperwork. So if we started out on chapter 6, again, at the beginning of each chapter is a list of keywords, vocabulary words, terms. It's always a great resource for you to go back, whether it's for study purposes or whether it's just for a review, see which ones you are confident in, see which ones you are not. But when we first start this chapter off, we want to define, since we're talking about contracts, we want to define what a contract is. And a contract is a voluntary agreement between two or more parties to either perform or to abstain from performing a certain legal act. And it's in which the parties have reached this meeting of the minds. And so if we were going to dissect this paragraph, you would, as you'll see when we go through this, there's several little terms that are scattered throughout this that are going to have to be, they'll be the elements of what makes up a valid contract. But before we get to that, we're going to break down different kinds of contracts. And in your book, there's actually a list of 6 of them, but we've taken them, we put them into 3 different categories. And it just so happens that they work out that way, and that also helps for memorization, for study purposes as well. And the first one is implied versus express contract. And an implied contract is created by an act. Okay? This is created by an act, like pumping gas. So when you go to the gas station, now maybe not so much today, but back in the day when you commonly paid cash or check for your gas, you would pump it first, and then you'd go in and you'd pay for it. When you go and sit down at a restaurant, you typically order your food, and then when you're done consuming it, then you pay the bill. That's a form of an implied contract. You're actually receiving the service first, then you're taking care of it afterwards, but it's implied that you're going to follow through. And an express contract is either written or oral. And so all of our real estate contracts are going to be under that category of express because they're written. Do you remember what is required, or what law requires that these contracts be in writing? Statute of frauds. That requires that these contracts be in writing. Next we have bilateral and unilateral contracts. So if you think of a bicycle or a unicycle, this could help you with remembering these terms. Bicycle, two wheels, 2 tires. And so in this bilateral contract, we have a promise for a promise. There's 2 promises in a bilateral contract. Both parties are obligated to perform. In a unilateral, I have, like a unicycle, I have 1 tire or 1 wheel. So I have 1 promise for an act. So there's only 1 promise in that. And so only 1 party is obligated to perform. So if I wanted to take these 2 contracts and apply them to our world in real estate, we have a bilateral contract when we put together a purchase agreement. We put together a purchase agreement. We have the seller promising to deliver the house to the buyer, and the buyer promising to pay the seller for the house. We have two promises. If I want to look at the unilateral, I could look at our, for example, our listing agreement that we make with our seller. The seller is the one giving the promise. The seller is promising that they are going to pay us a commission. And we're the one performing the act. We can't promise that we're going to sell their house. We can do the actions of marketing it and listing it hopefully at the right price and performing the duties, the services that are going to sell the house, but not every house is going to sell. And so we don't have that ability to make that promise. So that's a listing contract, or even our buyer agency, our buyer contracts are the same way. So those are examples of unilateral, whereas the purchase agreement is a bilateral. And then finally, our last two out of the six is executory versus executed. So what I want you to think of with the executory is these two signs. I have one sign with a sign rider hanging below it that says sale pending. That's an example of an executory contract. A sign that says sale pending means that I have a contract, but it hasn't been carried out yet. It's not completed. It's not finished. When I think of executed, think of my real estate sign sitting in the yard, and the sign rider that's hanging from it says sold. All the terms of the contract have been carried out. It's been executed. It's finished. Finito. Terminated. Done. That's executed. Yep. Well, it's good advertisement, and it depends on the local MLS rules. In this area, once the sale is done, the signs go down. So you won't see a sold sign sticking in or a rider around town. There might be some odd chance where the agent also had the buyer, and so it was limited agency, and so they keep the sign in the yard for whatever reason. But technically, once the sale is done, the sign's supposed to come down. So this is the only rider that you would see out of the two is sale pending. Yeah, it's not, I mean, you can hang a sold sign, but what you can't technically hang the sign that says sold until the sale's finished. And then our rules say if the sale's finished, the sign has to go down. Unless you have permission, but you'd have to, I mean, it just becomes a process that most agents don't seek out, so they just, once the sale's over, they have the sign taken down. And we talked about, one of those conceptions that I had when I was sitting in class, that I was going to have to not only buy a suit, but I was going to have to buy a shovel when I got in the business, because I was going to have to dig in and put those signs in. But there's a company, like I said, that will put those in for you, and they also take them out. And so you will typically, you or else the office administrator will order or set up the day for those signs to be taken down, which is the day of closing. So that'll all be taken care of. It's out of your hands. Next, we have a dual contract. Dual contract is where we have two contracts on the same property, and that is illegal. So an example of a dual contract would be where we'd have one contract agreed to between buyer and seller that goes to the lender for $150,000. And we have another contract agreed between buyer and seller that's just between them for $125,000. The one for $125,000 is actually what the property is going to sell for, and that's what the seller is going to put in their pocket. But the lender is actually going to finance it for $150,000, so the buyer is going to be able to take the difference and pocket it, and that's illegal, dual contracts. Now our elements of the contract. Remember back, if you would, to the definition of a contract. You're going to begin to see some of those words in that paragraph come to life when we go through these elements. The first one is offer and acceptance. That's the meeting of the minds. You can just slap those two terms together, especially for test purposes. Remember, we had a phrase back when we looked at the deed, and it was to have and to hold, and that was the habendum clause, or the habendum clause is to have and to hold. Offer and acceptance, same thing. It's a meeting of the minds, or we have mutual assent or mutual consent. That's offer and acceptance. Next is consideration. Consideration is going to be goods, or it can be things of value. It's not always going to be money, though predominantly it's going to be money in our contracts, but it doesn't have to be. Capacity of the parties, or parties that are legally competent. We could look at it either way. Your textbook, though, will talk about it more as the capacity of the parties. And this means that they have the capability from a legal position to carry out the terms of the contract. And we're going to dissect each one of these in the slides to come, so you'll see exactly what that means. Kind of has a twofold meaning. So the next one is the legality of the object. It has to be for a legal purpose. If I hire somebody to construct me a meth lab and they don't follow through, it's probably going to be difficult for me to sue them. Written and signed. If it's required by law that it's written and signed, which all of our real estate contracts are, and that's because, like we heard earlier, the statute of frauds requires it. So if that's the case, it has to be written and signed, and that's the final element of a valid contract. So to break this down, number one, offer and acceptance. Again, this is that meeting of the minds, and it's agreed by mutual consent or mutual assent. The terms, of course, have to be clearly defined. I remember a game that kids would play on the school bus where they would take a sheet of paper, fold it in half, and on the top part they would just say, you know, please sign here, and then they would unfold the bottom, and they were saying you formed a contract with them to be their slave for the rest of the week. Well, the terms weren't clearly defined. I only saw the top part. And as we continue on, you'll see that there's other elements that didn't make that contract valid. Legal consideration, or consideration, which is the second element. Again, this doesn't have to be money. It's a promise or something of value that will induce a party to enter into that contract with you. That's really what consideration is. I want you to remember, please, that earnest money is not a form of consideration. Okay? Earnest money is not consideration. In real estate, it's the selling price of the property that is going to be the consideration. Earnest money, all it is a good faith gesture of your seriousness of this offer. That's simply what earnest money is. It's nothing more than that. In fact, it isn't required in our real estate contracts. If you have a buyer that doesn't have the money or doesn't want to come up with earnest money, they don't have to. They're not required to. You may find, though, that when you put this offer together, that a realtor that is representing the seller could come back with the counter asking that you put some earnest money in, or asking if you, let's say you put in $100, or your buyer did, for earnest money, and they come back and say, well, we want you to put in $500 for earnest money. Does that mean you have to? No, this is a counter offer. Everything's negotiable. But just letting you know, you could see that. There is a philosophy that this earnest money is kind of them putting skin in the game. They're showing their seriousness of this offer. And if you are in a competing situation, or even if you're putting in maybe an aggressive lowball, quote-unquote, offer, the earnest money is a good indicator about how serious you are about this offer. And so if I'm going to, for instance, be in a competing situation where it's a multiple offer and I'm representing one of my buyers, the cleaner we make this offer, or the more appealing we make this offer, the better, right? It's going to give my buyer the chance to beat out the other buyers. And so one of the ways I can make this look more appealing is by putting in a sizable amount of earnest money. And there's not really a formula, because that is a question. I mean, how much should I put in? Is it 1% of the purchase price? Is it, this much if it's between, 50 to 100,000, and then between 100 to 150,000, it's this much? There really isn't a set rule as far as how much earnest money your buyer's required to put in or should put in. You'll learn as you get out there, and again, seeking the advice of your broker or a fellow agent that's competent is going to be a great way to discover what's going to be a good, appealing amount for earnest money. But again, it's not consideration and it's not required.
Does it go on the seriousness of the purchase or the value of the project? Let's say you're buying something for $150,000 as opposed to $1 million+. I thought it was just a $500.
There isn't a standard.
So
Chances are, if you're looking at a property that is in that $150,000, a $500 or a $1,000 earnest money is going to be perfectly fine. If you're putting in an offer for a house that's $1 million, you got to realize that your income level is going to be a lot different. If I'm qualified for $1 million property versus I'm only qualified for something that's $150,000, I'm going to have two different occupations. So that being said, for me to put down $500 or $1,000 if I'm qualified for $1 million is really not much out of my pocket. It's not really much of a sacrifice for me. Or it doesn't really show that I'm that serious. I mean, $500, on $1 million property, that's probably my gas bill for the month, right?
and see, I thought it was
So
paying for the process of the paperwork, but that has nothing to do with it.
yeah, you're not paying for anything, because that earnest money, when we get to the settlement statements, you'll see that it actually comes back into the buyer's pocket. It comes back to the buyer as a credit. And what it really does is it just kind of pays down the other fees that the buyer's going to have to come up with at closing, like the survey, the appraisal, underwriting, and things like that. But yeah, it's a great question. If I had a buyer putting in $1 million or an offer on $1 million property, we would have earnest money in the thousands. It would be something that might be $2,500, $5,000, $10,000 earnest money. But again, our job is to educate the buyer and to have an understanding of what would be reasonable, what would be show good faith for an offer at this price versus this price. But when it all comes down to it, it's still your buyer's decision. So if I have a buyer that's putting in an offer for a house that's $150,000, if they want to put in a $10,000 earnest money check, they certainly can. That's their call. Now, that being said, if they put in a $10,000 earnest money, or that's what how much they're willing to put in for earnest money on a property that's worth $150,000, it might be difficult for them to lowball the seller. Because if I'm going to put an offer in on a property that's marketed at 150 and my offer is at 110, but I have a $10,000 earnest money, it's going to be difficult for the seller to really believe that I can't afford 150. So there's a game. It's part of negotiations, and the more you understand, the better you're going to be able to represent your buyer and get them the best deal.
You got $10,000 put down, they have money, but they have houses around multiple places. It's just better that they don't need to do that.
They don't, exactly.
Okay.
It's not necessary. If I'm working with a buyer and they say, well, let's put $10,000 down. If I was in a multiple offer situation and we wanted to make this as appealing as possible, I might do it at that point. But I'm just your typical situation where it's just me putting in an offer, nobody else is competing with me. 10,000 is just, it's not necessary. They can put in 1,000, and that's perfectly fine. But this is coming from my perception. So I guarantee, Marlis, if we had other realtors in here, there'd be a debate over what's right. And this is not, again, I can be wrong. There could be a better approach to earnest money than the way I'm presenting it. But nobody's here to argue it with me. So.
But my point was that the person that puts down the earnest money and the value, the person that thinks the value of the property is nothing.
Yep. And when you look at negotiations in this business, it is similar to poker. You got to be willing to let the other party sweat it and see if they're going to call your bluff. But again, in poker, you got to know when to hold them and you got to know when to fold them, right?
But look on the other end, though. Let's say that I'm really anxious to sell my house because I need to sell my house to do the house that I want. Okay? So let's say he makes a purchase or a bid on my house, but I don't know if he really has the money or not. Then I just have all that anxiety. Where you come down and you pay more earnest money.
No, and that's a competing situation, and you're going to pick the one that looks more appealing. So I agree 100%. Now, as a seller or as a listing agent, which your agent or you, if you're representing a seller, you're going to make sure that every offer is accompanied with a pre-approval letter. So it says that this person is approved for this house. But if you get two offers, one with no earnest money and one with $10,000, even if my offer is for a little bit less money, you're going to start negotiating with me first. See if you can get me up to where you want, because I'm willing to put more skin in the game. And I got a nice chunk of change to put down. Yeah, exactly.
Generally, a person that has a house for sale already understands what they want to do. So they're very eager to leave.
Yep.
So that's why.
They're serious about selling, and they're wanting a buyer that's serious about buying. Exactly. Capacity of the parties. If I go back to my childhood example of riding on the school bus and signing contracts, I was under the age of 18, so I didn't have capacity. So when my cousin tricked me into being his servant for a week, I didn't have to follow through. I did for the first couple days, and then it just kind of fell off. But at any rate, you have to be 18 years of age and older. That's one of the facets of capacity. So legal age. Now you see the word minors there. You could also see it say minority. And when we think minority, we don't think of people under the age of 18. That's just not how the term is used. But from a legal point, they could use the word minority on a test, and they may be talking about somebody under the age of 18. Now, hopefully the question is worded in a way that you can decipher that. Okay? But just understand that they may use that in different manners. So to have capacity, you have to be able to understand, so mentally understand, and then physically be able to carry out the terms. Another facet, or the other side of that coin, is mental capacity. So you have the age capacity, and we have the mental capacity underneath capacity of the parties. Mental capacity is either somebody that, or to somebody that wouldn't qualify as somebody that isn't mentally competent, somebody that maybe has a mental illness, or something similar to that that would affect their ability to comprehend what they're getting into. And then the other part is somebody who would be intoxicated. Somebody that was a little bit too drunk to enter into a contract. Again, they didn't know what they were fully getting into. So if you are working, let's say you're representing some sellers, and it's been a long haul. This house has been on the market for 4 months. The sellers are really getting desperate, and finally we get an offer. And it's actually a pretty decent offer. And the sellers, they don't accept it right out of the gate. We counter back and forth. But finally we come up with an agreement between us, me, the agent, and my clients, the sellers, and the other side. So we have an agreement. And so I get the papers from the buyer's agent, and I'm on my way over to visit with the sellers and have them sign, and everything will be finalized. But they actually started celebrating a little bit earlier in the day, and by the time you get to their house, they're barely coherent. In fact, the kids are the ones answering the door. Mom is halfway passed out on the couch, and I still need signatures. They verbally already agreed to the terms on the phone, and I'm simply finalizing the deal with mom and dad's signatures, but they're pretty intoxicated. And I don't have the ability to gauge how intoxicated they are. They may be fine to sign, but chances are, the condition that I observe, they're not. So it's something that you need to be aware of. Does it happen all the time? No. Typically, in a situation like that, they'll start partying after they get the signatures. But just pointing that out. Now, if somebody says they were too drunk to sign, most likely they'll have to be able to prove that. They can't just say it out of whim, well, I was just too drunk, I didn't know what I was signing. So it might end up in court where they'd have to be able to prove to a judge that I wasn't capable of putting my signature on the paper. And then it gets difficult from there, because who am I going to have as my witnesses? My drunk buddies? And or the bartender? And most bartenders, at least, are instructed by the bar owner that we got to shut people off at a certain point, otherwise it becomes a liability, right? And so you're not going to get a bartender to admit that, yeah, I just kept feeding this guy more alcohol and he was way too drunk. So don't need to beat that dead horse, but just giving you an idea. It's one of the things you could see possibly happening, maybe not. Next element is that it has to be written and signed. Statute of Frauds says that all real estate contracts, except for a lease that's less than 12 months, has to be written and signed by both parties. So it has to be written and signed to avoid fraud and also to be enforceable. An oral contract to buy or a verbal contract to buy or sell would not be upheld in court because of that statute of frauds. And while we're on there, that subject, let's talk about the parole evidence rule, which is similar. In fact, the definitions, even in the test world, can be so close that you might have a tough time distinguishing which is which if on the multiple choice you had both parole evidence rule and statute of frauds as your options. So the parole evidence rule textbook definition is prior or written evidence or verbal evidence. Prior written or verbal evidence may not alter an agreement. And so again, when we look at the parole evidence rule, the judge is going to say everything within the four corners of the document is what I'm going to look at. Anything outside of that is going to be inadmissible. And as we see when we're going to go through the list or the purchase agreement, that there are other forms that attach themselves to it. So here's our purchase agreement. And here's our other forms out there, like the property disclosure, the personal property addendum, lead-based paint disclosure. But the verbiage in these contracts, whether it's a counteroffer or a personal property agreement addendum, they will attach themselves, whether it's their verbiage or it's the verbiage that you find in the purchase agreement, to that purchase agreement. And so all of those will be gathered and collected, and it will be viewed by the judge if it's taken to court. So we had an example earlier of a seller telling a buyer verbally that if you buy this property, you can have the John Deere riding lawnmower. But when it came time to closing and the buyer showed up at their brand new house, there wasn't a lawnmower. Well, the buyers really don't have recourse for that because nothing was ever spelled out in the purchase agreement. Nothing was ever mentioned after that conversation before the buyers put in the offer. So because nothing was put in writing and attached to that purchase agreement or included in the purchase agreement, the buyers are just out of luck. They got to go down and buy their own lawnmower. Now we're going to look at the different things that make a contract valid or void or unenforceable or voidable. Validity of contracts. There are a few different types here, and please pay close attention because these can be a little bit confusing as to would this be avoidable or this is going to be unenforceable or a void contract. The first one, the valid contract, is pretty easy to get right because a valid contract is one that has all the essential elements of a contract, all the ones that we just went through. It's met all those standards, and so now it's enforceable in a court of law. The next one, though, that void contract, is where it's missing an essential element of the contract. It has no legal force. And these are going to be the three ways you can see a void contract manifest, is where we have a contract entered into for an illegal purpose. That's going to be void. It's not going to be unenforceable. It's not going to be voidable. It's void. If an operation of law prevents completion, so let's say you hired a builder to build on this new lot that you bought, but before they began construction, they rezoned the lot, which, I mean, this is in some crazy world that probably wouldn't happen, but now it's zoned commercial and you can't build residential. The builder can't come back and say, look, we had an agreement, but the point is that they can't. It's illegal for them to build because it's not zoned for residential now, it's zoned commercial. Inactive nature prevents completion. So your buyer and seller come together, we got an offer, it goes sale pending after it's accepted, but the house burns down. So we can't complete on this transaction because there's no house for the buyer to live in, let alone the seller. Voidable is where one party can rescind. Typically in the scenarios that I'll present, the other party can't. So one party can rescind, the other party can't. So for instance, if let's say there was a 16-year-old and went down to the local car dealership and got into a lease contract on a brand new GMC Yukon. He's only 16. Now, the car dealership, they're all over the age of 18, and so they're legally bound to the contract. The 16-year-old isn't. Now, the 16-year-old can carry out the terms of the contract, that 16-year-old can decide to just continue to make the lease payments and lease the vehicle. But it is voidable by them, by the 16-year-old, because they lack capacity. They're a minor. So that would be a voidable contract. It has the option to be voided. Another example would be where a party acted under duress. They felt like they didn't have any alternative but to sign. Or maybe there was fraud involved. They thought they were buying this, but they're actually buying something else. Unenforceable is where a contract appears valid, but it's not. Maybe a purchase agreement that's verbal. We have all the other terms, but it's verbal. It's not valid because it has to be in writing in order to be valid according to the statute of frauds. So neither party can sue the other to force performance. Misrepresentation, something that you could see come up in your real estate career. And it's where one party is making a decision based on information that isn't true or is inaccurate. So I'm representing a seller, I'm listing the house, and the seller assures me that they have never had water in the basement. It's never an issue for them. And so I'm out there repeating that to every buyer that comes in through an open house and every realtor that calls me asking questions. But the truth is that there is water. Every spring, when the ground thaws and the snow melts, they get an inch to an inch and a half of water in the basement, just standard. They don't have any drain tiling or no way to drain it off, so it just comes right into the house. And so if a buyer would buy a house based on what I've told them, that would be misrepresentation. They were presented a picture that wasn't clear. But if you look at the second bullet point, I was out there unknowingly making these statements, just based on the good faith that the seller is going to tell me the truth. The seller, though, was committing fraud. They knew that the basement got water every year, and they were deceiving intentionally me and the buyers, potential buyers, into believing that this house was safe and secure. In that case, the damaged party, which is the buyer, could rescind and collect damages. A mistake is where one party changes their mind or they have a change of heart. On a buyer's end, we might call that where the buyers get cold feet. Maybe a week before closing, the buyers just realize that, you know what, we're not ready to buy a house. This is too big of a financial investment, and we just don't feel comfortable. We want to back out. They have a change of heart. Okay, that's a mistake. So please understand the difference between misrepresentation, fraud, and a mistake. And if it's a mistake, both parties can agree mutually that it's a mistake, and then the contract can be rescinded. So the seller could very well let them out. Yeah.
Is there a time frame on that?
A-
I mean, the cold feet thing.
The buyers can get cold feet at any time before signing their names away at closing.
So they could be at the closing office and walk away if they just...
The seller does not have to let them out because it's a legally binding contract. Right. So that's a great point.
Oh, yeah.
Even if the buyers do get cold feet, even if it's right there at the closing table, the day of closing, the sellers still can hold their feet to the fire and say, nope, we're going to push this through. Now, the sellers can't come in and physically force the buyers to sign. If the buyers say, no, we're serious, we don't want to buy this house, and they just excuse themselves and leave, now we have some issues. Now we have some recourses that the seller has, and vice versa. It could happen where the sellers get cold feet and say, you know what, we don't want to sell. This is the house that we raised our kids in, and there's too many memories here. There's recourses that the buyer has, which we're going to get to in just a little bit. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Does that really happen, or that is just, we're just doing a scenario and it's just laws and everybody protects each other?
It doesn't usually happen on the seller end, where the seller gets cold feet. It's usually the buyer. The buyer may get cold feet, and I've had to talk a few buyers off the cliff a few times. Now, it's my job to promote what's in their best interest, and so when I'm talking the buyer off the cliff, for instance, my motivation isn't because I got to get paid. I got to get my commission check, and if they back out, I'm not going to get paid. It's that it's common. Just like if I was a pastor and I had a young couple getting married, it's common to have cold feet. Does that mean you shouldn't get married? Most of the time you should. It's just common to have these second guess jitters and so on. But if in discussing it with the buyers, and that's going to be something that you'll decide, and please talk to your broker about, if they just lay everything out and it just becomes so clear, cut and dry that they shouldn't be buying this house, and that's the direction they want you to take it, then that's the direction you're going to have to go down. But again, it's something that a buyer does, and I would say that a lot of buyers feel that, but I would also say that maybe from my experience, maybe one out of every 30 or 40 buyers actually express it to me. Just like in the wedding situation. How many husbands actually had cold feet, but they just never told their wife or their fiance? So whether it gets verbalized or not, that's pretty minimum. But there is going to be some of that, especially a first-time home buyer. I mean, all they've ever done is rented, and now I'm locking myself in for the next 30 years on this mortgage. And there's uncertainties in my life, and not sure if this is the road I want to go down. But usually the picture is so much bigger that they continue through. They realize that it's the best choice for them. And then we have duress and undue influence. Two separate terms, duress and undue influence. They both mean about the same thing. Okay? They both mean about the same thing. But duress is where somebody signs because they don't have any other way out and there's a threat of bodily harm. So it's like the Jimmy Hoffa School of Real Estate, where I'm going to break your legs if you don't sign this listing agreement or if you don't sign this purchase agreement. So there's a threat of bodily harm when we talk about duress. Undue influence is where a party feels like they don't have any other alternative because of just pressure from an outside source. They don't feel like they have a choice. So for instance, if I'm going over to visit with a potential seller, it's an older lady, her husband has passed away, she's lived in the house for 45 years, and she tells me that her kids are telling her she needs to sell the house and move into an apartment. And so I sit and visit with her, and we have a good conversation, and then I get the information on her house so I can go back to my office and do a market analysis. But when I come back to talk to her about the price a few days later, her kids are there. And they're just hovering over their mom. And just, you hear conversations back and forth about them just telling her flat out, you need to sell. You need to sell, Mom. And every time she raises an objection, their position is sell, sell, sell. And she's a little bit scattered, and so you can tell that she's almost reluctant when she's signing the listing agreement. She just feels that pressure. And every time you talk to her, every time you do an open house, the kids are there, or you get phone calls from the kids, and they're vehement about it. We have to sell the house. That could be a position of undue influence. This mom, maybe in all reality, it would be in her best interest to sell, but that's her decision to make. And when she's constantly pressured and harassed by her kids, she may feel like this is the only alternative. You know, Maybe I am at that time in my life where I need to let my kids start helping me make decisions. Whatever the reason is, you need to be aware that that could be an example or situation of undue influence. I don't know that I would continue forward. Like you said, it's got to be a judgment call. I would certainly discuss it with your broker and say, here's the situation. And then I would think if we're looking at the extreme side of it, closer to the picture that I'm painting, you're going to have to make the decision that, you know what, you're going to have to either find another agent or we're going to have to sit down with the kids and talk this out. Because it says in that slide that it's voidable by her. So let's say she puts a house on the market and it is clear that this is undue influence, and she gets an offer, the kids pressure her into accepting it, but 2 days before closing, she just kicks the kids out of the house and says, look, I don't want to sell this. It is voidable by her, but now you just kind of ruined the buyers' lives because they have maybe sold their house or given their 30-day notice at the apartment and they got everything loaded up in the U-Haul. And so now you could have some ramifications back on her. So we're hired to protect what's in her best interest. And so I would say you're going to have that talk earlier, and you might not even sign the listing. So it is a judgment call, but you need to have that conversation with your broker first and then move forward from there. Next, we talk about performance of a contract. When performance will transpire or when a contract is terminated. And I use that word terminated specifically, and you'll see it in italics, because when I think of a contract being terminated, to me it seems like it's been canceled, or the buyers have just walked away, or we're just going to end this. Because to me, termination is more of a negative connotation. But it's really another way of saying when a contract has been executed, or when a contract, or when performance has occurred. We can use all of those three phrases interchangeably. So when I think of executed, we understand that from earlier. An executed contract is the one with the sold sign hanging. Its closing has taken place. The contract has been finished out. But I could also look at executed as somebody back in the old days when we had execution, or like back in medieval days, somebody's in the guillotine or in the Old West with the gallows. They're being executed. I'd also say they're being terminated, or think of the movie Terminator. And so really this is just something's ended. In those examples, somebody's life has ended, unfortunately, but in this example, a contract has ended. So they could talk about on an exam that this contract's been terminated, and don't feel like how I would approach it is that something foul would happen or something negative happened here. It's just, no, it's been closed out, it's finished. And so on a purchase contract, that's on the closing date, the purchase agreement or the offer. On a lease, it's when the lease is up. So if I'm in a 6-month lease, when the 6 months is up, this lease is terminated or performance has been completed. So on carrying out the terms of the contract, we will see a term called assignment. Assignment of a contract, and all contracts are assignable unless otherwise noted. So when we talk about this word assignment, I want to kind of switch gears because we've been talking about the purchase agreement so much already, but now I'm going to talk about a different contract, and that's a lease. And so the example I'm going to give you is in a lease situation, and every lease is assignable unless it says something else to that regard. And in a lease that is assignable, it's typically going to be set up to protect the owner or the landlord, and it will have some stipulation in there that you can assign this, but you have to first get approval from the landlord. You're going to have to get their blessing. For instance, in the strip center that this school is located in, there's other businesses. There's an insurance company, for instance. And when that insurance agent came in, he may have had in his lease stating that no other insurance companies can lease space in this strip center. And the landlord may have agreed to that. And so if I'm going to assign this space to somebody else, there's already one industry or profession that I couldn't assign this space to, and that would be an insurance company. Okay? So what an assignment would look like is, let's say I'm in a 3-year lease here. So I'm in a 3-year lease, and I'm halfway through it. I'm at a year and a half I've been here. And ProEd, or this school, is growing. Class sizes are getting bigger, and I need more room. And I find a space that would better suit my needs, and I also find somebody who would love to come in and move into this space. This is a perfect fit for them. It's not an insurance agent, so it's going to work out well. The landlord gives their blessing, and they're fine with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this other company move in and just basically take over the lease. They're going to be me. They're going to pay the lease payments that I paid. They're going to be here for the rest of the lease, the rest of the 3 years, or another year and a half. So how this looks like, so here's my assignment. I have the landlord that leases to me, and I'm going to call myself tenant 1. Okay? And this will be tenant 2. That's the person that's going to come in my place, and they're going to lease or finish out the terms of the lease. They're going to pay the rent to the landlord. In this scenario, I will be the assignor, and tenant 2 will be the assignee. So as you look at this closer, if you're the landlord, is this not a good position to be in? As you look at these lines, tenant 1, or myself, I'm still bound or attached in this circle. In other words, if tenant 2 stops making payments, guess who the landlord can come back at and request money from? And let's say the tenant 2, in the middle of the night, just picks up and moves and breaks a couple walls down, and guess who's going to be responsible? Now, in the real world, most assuredly the landlord will go after tenant 2, but if tenant 2 is moved to another country and they can't locate him or they can't track him down, then it's on me. I'm still attached to this. So the assignor in this case is me. Please don't confuse that with the landlord. A lot of times we talk about these assignors, assignees, or the grantor, grantee, lessor, lessee. Usually the seller or the owner is going to be the or, but in this case it's actually the tenant. I would just be the lessee, and this is the lessor. Yep. So as you look on your next slide, you'll see this new vocabulary term called novation. You can also see novation used interchangeably with the phrase an assignment with a release. So an assignment with a release is the same thing as novation. So here's my example of novation. I have the landlord, and remember the landlord was leasing to me, tenant 1. And then I had tenant 2 come in, and I assigned it to them. I'm the assignor, they're the assignee. In an assignment with the release, myself as tenant 1 am removed from the picture. So now the lease is just between tenant 2 and the landlord, and the tenant 2 continues to make the payments to the landlord. So there's a substitution of one party for the other. You could also see for an exam that it's a substitution of one contract for another. But that's what an assignment with the release looks like, which I would think that kind of makes a little bit more sense because the tenant 1 is released out of the situation. But remember that that word or phrase is used interchangeably with novation. So we have an assignment with the release and novation. Typically, I get a question that asks, well, what about subleasing? What's that? How does that play into all this? So subleasing is similar, but different. And we will talk about subleasing in a later chapter. But again, I like to reiterate things for you. So let's do subleasing right now. Sublet or a sublease is where I have the landlord leasing to me tenant 1. And in this space that I'm currently in, I have 2 offices up front. One office is mine, the other one isn't really used that much. It's actually a rather large space, and if I found somebody that wanted to just maybe start their own business, or they didn't need a large office space, they just needed a space there, they didn't need a big building or a big space like this, and I wanted to sublease it to them, that's how this would work. Again, a sublease situation or sublet would have to be approved by the landlord. And so I would find that tenant to lease that space up front. And again, I'm going to call them tenant 2. But they're going to pay me the money. So I'm going to be kind of like a mini landlord. They're going to pay me the money, and there's not going to be any connection between tenant 2 and the landlord. So in that case, I'm the sublessor, and tenant 2 is the sublessee. So there is a distinct difference between assignment and subleasing. And primarily it has to deal with the connection between tenant 2 and the landlord. So I'll collect rent payments every month from tenant 2, and then I'm still responsible to make my monthly payments to the landlord. Whatever that agreed amount is. Yes?
Unheard then, the sublease is the relationship between the tenant and nothing with the landlord.
Correct. There's no relationships in a sublease between the tenant and the landlord.
If you sublease, do you have to charge them the same
If I'm subleasing, I can charge whatever fee I want to charge, whatever fee the tenant will pay. Now, chances are, again, I have to get permission from the landlord to sublease. Chances are, if I'm going to sublease, let's say my rent is $1,000 a month. If I sublease, my rent will probably go up to $1,250 a month. The landlord's going to charge me more. And that's may not be fair to me, because if I'm only going to charge that new tenant $300 a month, that means that I'm just making $50, right? But here's the reason, or the logic behind it, is that now I have another tenant coming in and out. I have the light switch being used more. I have the carpets being used more. The fridge is opening more. All the things that the landlord is responsible for is going to have an increased wear and tear. So that's the justification that they have to increasing the rent. There's more people there, the rent's going to be higher. You might see that in neighborhoods that are close to colleges where they rent out the houses. They might charge more rent if there's more tenants there, because you have more wear and tear. So it's negotiable.
You always have to let the landlord know, say you have a right to sublet condition. Would it say you have to let them know if you sublease?
If it doesn't, then you wouldn't. Yep. And you know, sometimes those contracts the landlord puts together on their own, and so they don't think about those scenarios. And unless they have an attorney that's knowledgeable in lease negotiations or a commercial leasing agent, they may miss it. So if it's not spelled out, then you found a loophole. Next we see latent and patent defects. They don't just say hidden and visible, because that would be too obvious, right?
Let's not make it easy.
Let's not make it easy. Latent defects are hidden defects. Those all have to be disclosed by the seller. Seller's going to know the house better than you will, right? Because it's their house. So they're going to know if there's a leaky faucet, or they're going to know if there's a leaky pipe underneath the sink. That's a hidden defect. That's not something you'll see. When you go to list a house, you don't have to open up every cabinet. You don't have to perform an inspection on the furnace. None of that. Those are all hidden defects that the seller should disclose, is required to disclose. You, though, should be aware of the visible defects or the patent defects. So you got large cracks in the sidewalk. Again, those questions are on our local or on our state property disclosure forms. But things that are visible to us, we should be aware of. One other thing, let's say we list the house, the seller fills out the seller's property condition disclosure, and they do it honestly and to the best of their knowledge. But we get an offer a few months later, the buyers ask for a home inspection, the home inspector comes out, and the home inspector finds some issues with the house. There's an issue with the air conditioner. And there's also an issue with some water leaking in the attic. The seller never saw these issues, never noticed it, of course, but now there's these issues. If the buyers agree to move forward or negotiate something with the seller, but essentially move forward with the deal, there's nothing that needs to be changed. But if the buyers end up backing out of the deal because of those issues or maybe something else, the deal falls through, now the house is back on the market, the seller's going to have to make some changes to the property condition disclosure to reflect those new issues that came up. So one way is they can completely fill out a new property condition disclosure and add those things in there that are wrong with the house, or on a separate form we can make an addendum that would say these items as well are issues with the house. There may be some other ways, but you would need to talk with your broker on how that issue would be handled. But the point is that moving forward, if the deal fell through, those new issues now have to be disclosed to the public because the seller's aware of them. And so are you. So I mentioned that we're going to get to the recourses that a seller has if a buyer backs out, and the recourses that a buyer has if a seller backs out. One of the issues, or one of the recourses, is called specific performance. You might also see it as a suit, like a lawsuit, S-U-I-T, a suit of specific performance. And this is a remedy in court that forces the party or a party to comply with the terms of the contract or to carry out the terms of the contract. So if a buyer gets cold feet, wants to back out, a seller can sue the buyer for specific performance or a suit of specific performance. And in other words, that seller is trying to force the buyer to buy the house legally. So here's the 4 recourses if the buyer backs out. The seller can rescind the offer. Another word for rescind, we'll see later, is called tender. Tender, T-E-N-D-E-R, just like you tenderize a steak, tender. It's another word used on a legal, in a legal manner for the word rescind. So the seller could basically cancel. You can also use rescind as withdraw. In other words, just going to let the buyer out of the deal. So that's number 1. Number 2, the seller could keep the earnest money. And typically our contracts are spelled out that that is what would happen. The seller could retain that earnest money. Again, the deal would still be rescinded. The buyers would be let out, but the sellers would say, we're going to keep your earnest money. That's usually what happens, is the seller lets them out, but they keep the earnest money. You got to realize that if we got an offer, from the time the offer is written and accepted to the time that we actually close can be anywhere from 30, 45 to 60 days. And the majority of that time, the house has been off the market. And the sellers have lost out on possible offers and maybe even offers that were for a better deal. And so now the house is going to go back on the market. And it could be going back on the market in December, when it's not really a favorable time to be selling a house. So the seller's been put in a pickle, and they could ask for that, or they could demand that they keep the earnest money. If that's the case, remember that there are 2 ways that the earnest money can be released under South Dakota license law. Anybody remember those 2 ways that the earnest money would be released? Exactly. Signatures from both buyer and seller on an earnest money release form and court order are the only 2 ways that the broker can release that earnest money. Third is the seller could resell the house and sue the buyer for the difference in the loss. So in this scenario, let's say our first deal between the buyer and seller had a agreed price of $175,000. This one is the one where the buyer's backed out, and we're going to use example number 3. So the sellers had an agreed purchase price of $175,000, but this deal went bye-bye. So deal number 2, which happened 3 months later, the sellers agreed to $169,000 even. So they're selling it for less on deal number 2. So they could sue the buyer for the difference, which is how much? $6,000. When it comes to court, I always say whoever gets the best attorney wins. So, yep, it is. Because then if I was the attorney for the defendant, which is the buyer from deal number one, I would have to argue that, yeah, this price isn't, they didn't set it at what market value is. They took a severe reduction. So, well, number 1 and 2 would be decided outside of court because contractually the sellers have the right to retain the earnest money. Or number 1, that would just be a mutual agreement to rescind the offer. But yeah, 3 and 4, that's going to be, we're going to court. Yep. So $6,000 is a substantial amount. But let's say it wasn't that drastic. Let's say it was only $3,000. Then a seller's going to have to figure out, well, number 1, would the buyers have the money? Can I get it out of them? And then what are my legal fees going to be to try and get $3,000? So number 4 is sue for the balance of the purchase price. In other words, they would just sue them for $175,000 in this example. So we have an offer on the table. It's accepted at $175,000. It's our first deal. These buyers are now wanting out. So we're going to sue them and state, you are going to pay us $175,000. Or in other words, we're going to force you to buy this house. So that's specific performance, forcing them to buy. Now, in the real world, you could have this happen where the deal falls through and the sellers are irate and they say, well, we're going to force these buyers to buy and we're going to take them to court and sue them for everything they got. Here's the thing. It's going to be $15,000 to $20,000 just for your retainer to get an attorney to take this to court. And you got about a 2 to 3 year process of this happening. And then lastly, the likelihood of a judge actually forcing a buyer to buy a house is pretty unlikely. On the other end, if the buyer it wants to carry out the terms, but the seller gets cold feet or the seller wants to back out, the buyer can sue for specific performance. Similar process, but the likelihood of a judge forcing a seller to sell is a little bit more likely. So they might have a better chance. But again, you're tying yourself up for maybe 2 to 3 years in court. Is it really worth it? It may be. If I'm a buyer, I guess it may be. If that's the house, that's my dream house. Maybe I hired a builder to build my dream home that I've been saving up since I was 16 for. And the builder fell in love with it and decided they weren't going to transfer the title to me. And now I'm taking them to court. Whatever the reason is. There could be some odd example that we are going to sue them for specific performance. So now if we look at the 3 recourses of the buyer, number 1, if the seller backs out, the buyer can rescind and release them of any further obligations. They can, number 2, sue them for specific performance, just like how the seller would be able to force the buyer to buy. Now they would force the seller to sell. Number 3, they can sue them for money damages. They would have to prove in court with receipts and documentation that these damages did occur, but we're looking at things like costs of moving, like paying for the U-Haul, storage if they had to put some things in storage, or renting an apartment. Again, it'd have to be proven. So I've had a similar thing happen with a seller who the seller got an offer, it got accepted, and the next week they moved half of their stuff across country to another state that they were moving to They got an apartment, got a storage unit, and then 3 weeks later the deal fell apart because of home inspections. Well, it's going to be pretty difficult for that seller to get any money damages out of the buyer when the seller didn't have a done deal. There was still an inspection contingency. There were still other contingencies out there, other variables that should have been taken care of first before the seller had that peace of mind that they could actually go out and put money down for an apartment and get a storage unit and so on. The Uniform Commercial Code primarily deals when we have real estate and personal property being transferred. So it's a law that deals with commercial sales. It's an attempt to make everything uniform in those transactions, including when we transfer chattel, which is also called personalty and also called personal property. An option to purchase. An option, first off, to define that, is a contract granting the exclusive right to buy for a limited time. So here's the example I'll paint for you. We have, and this is commonly done in this area and other cities across the nation, we have a developer in the city, and they look at the city's current growth. Let's say this is our city in 2010. Those are the city limits, or that's how far out the city has grown. But the projection for the year 2030, the city is going to look like this. So let's put ourselves in the year 2010. The developer knows that the city is going to grow, and this is the projected growth. There's roads going in these areas. They can already see construction begin to spill out. And so the developer would approach, let's say, a farmer that has some ground down in this area. And what they would do is, through the use of this option, they would guarantee themselves the right to buy that land within so many years. So let's say they're going to do a 20-year option. They're going to give them $50,000 down. And let's say they have an agreed price of $1.2 million. Now, when we get into the actual real world and we look at the purchase price, which is the last one I put up there, that is all negotiable. We could say that we'll give you fair market value minus 10%. Or we'll give you $1 million within the first 5 years, $1.2 million within the next 5 years, $1.4 million within the next 5 years, however they wanted to negotiate that. So it's not that important to understand that part of it as it is to understand the rest of it for your exam and how this option works. So they're going to do this 20-year option. The seller is the one that's going to grant the option or give the option. So the seller would be the optionor. The developer is going to be the optionee. They're the one receiving the option. So the seller's the one giving, so they're the optionor. The developer is the optionee. The down payment, the $50,000, is typically non-refundable. That farmer gets to keep that $50,000. And another thing the farmer gets to continue to do is keep farming the land. It's really a win for the farmer, and you'll see that it's also a win for the developer. So the farmer gets to continue to farm this land, but over the course of the 20 years, if the developer decides to what they call exercise the option, which means they're going to move forward and buy the land at whatever agreed price, then the farmer has already agreed to sell it to them. But when the farmer sells, they're going to get fair market value, or maybe what market value is minus 10%, which is still fair. Because if you look at the gamble you might have if you wanted to put the property up for auction, in a market that we have seen where land prices are continuing to go up, the farmer would make maybe more when they put it on auction because there's more buyers. But let's say land prices settle out and maybe start to decrease a little bit. Fair market value minus 10% would be a pretty good deal, because if I put it up on auction, I may have just 2 buyers show up and I could get a pretty bad deal as that farmer. So however they construct this, purchase price is between them. But again, the win for the developer is that they have this chunk of ground secured for them, so that when the city grew out there, they didn't have to pay top dollar. They got to pay for it at a decent price, and the land would not be sold out from under them. This is an example of a unilateral contract. The promise is only on the part of the optionor, or the farmer. They are promising to sell the land. The developer doesn't have to buy. The 20 years could come and go, and once that's 20 years is up, that land falls out of that option, and the farmer can continue to farm it and sell it to whomever he or she pleases. Also, this option can be assigned. Let's say the developer ends up putting a bunch of money into a project on the northwest side of the city, and this isn't as favorable to them, so they just assign it to another developer. They can certainly do that as well. So the difference between an option contract and a purchase agreement is an option contract gives them the option to buy within a specified period of time. A purchase agreement, you have to buy. It's binding. It's legally binding. So there is a difference. Lastly, while we're talking about an optionor, optionee, and we've expressed this throughout, we'll continue to discuss more of these terms, but remember, the or, the option or, the OR, is always the one giving, and the double E, the optionee in this case, is always the one receiving. So when I look at items like a purchase agreement, the grantee is the buyer, the grantor is the seller. A land contract, we have the vendee and the vendor. Those are maybe a little bit different words to us, but that's the terms that they use to describe the buyer and seller in a land contract. A land contract is also known as a contract for deed or a land installment contract. Most people recognize contract for deed, may not understand how it works, which we'll look at here on our financing day. But a contract for deed or a land installment contract or a land contract is going to have the vendee as the buyer, the vendor as the seller. Assignment, assignee, assignor. Offer to purchase is exactly the offer to purchase, you'll see, is changed around, because who's the one giving in this situation, in an offer? Who's the one? The buyer. The buyer is the one giving. They're the offeror. The seller is the one receiving. Same thing when we look below that at the mortgage. The buyer's the one giving the mortgage. They're the mortgagor. I wish you could have seen the faces of the realtors that were in here on Friday or Saturday when I said that the buyer or borrower gives a mortgage, because half of them are like, what? They'd give a mortgage? Because in the, out in the sales world, these things kind of slip out. You're not going to, and I won't feel bad if you don't remember in the next 2 years what fee simple absolute is, because you're just not going to use it. So if you don't use it, you lose it. The deed of trust, or trust deed, we looked at that in chapter 5. The trust deed or deed of trust, the trustor is the buyer, and the lender is the beneficiary, and the trustee is the third party. In a lease, we have the lessor, which is the owner or landlord, and the tenant is going to be the lessee.